Welcome back to our afternoon portion of the EdCog conference. Hope you had a great virtual lunch if you were one of the people that signed up for our lunch roundtables or had some sort of productive or restorative break. We are now going into our Data Blitz presentation. So these are short 5-minute talks from our researchers, and we have 7 talks today. Our first speaker is Michelle Rivers, and the title of her presentation is, "What do learners believe about practice testing and do they use it effectively?" And I will be advancing your slides, so please just let me know when to go on to the next slide.
All right, hi everybody. My name is Michelle. I'm a graduate student at Kent State University, and I recently conducted a review of over 80 articles looking at what learners believe about practice testing. And today I'm just going to be summarizing some findings from this review. So what do learners believe about practice testing and do they use it effectively? Next slide. So given the audience, I'm just going to speed through this part and tell you that practice testing is a highly robust strategy for long-term retention. What I'm showing here are data from Roediger and Karpicki, who found that memory for text passages after a delay was higher for students who took a practice test compared to those who restudied or reread the passage. This finding, referred to as the testing effect, has been found across many different types of materials in different contexts and for all different types of learners. But given that most learning takes place outside of supervised learning environments, for students to fully benefit from this strategy, they would need to appreciate the effectiveness of this testing and use it in their own learning. So do they do that? Next slide. So what I'm presenting here are data from 13 studies across over 6,000 students, and these were middle school, high school, college, and graduate students who responded to surveys asking them to report what strategies they use in their own learning. And what you'll see is that students do report using practice testing almost at the same rate that they report using restudying. However, only a minority, that is 10%, report using practice testing as their primary learning strategy. Now, one reason for this is learners might not view practice testing as a learning strategy per se. Instead, they may see it as a tool to monitor what they know and what they don't know, which can inform whether or not they need to continue studying. So some evidence for this comes from studies that have asked students to report the primary reason why they test themselves when they study, and that's the next slide. And again, this is aggregated across 10 studies that have asked this question. And what you'll see is most students report testing themselves to figure out how well they've learned the material that they're studying. Only 27% say they test themselves because they would learn more that way than they would through rereading or restudying. So to summarize learners' beliefs, without support, they don't necessarily recognize the advantage of practice testing over restudying for learning. Now, this may be in part because in educational settings, tests are typically used as an assessment tool, and testing can also feel more difficult than restudying, which can lead to a false sense of fluency for the material being learned. Next slide. So when learners do use testing, how are they using it? Well, they tend to only use it under certain conditions. And one of those conditions is whether or not they think retrieval will be successful. So for example, learners tend to choose to test themselves on material that they perceive to be very easy to remember, or they test themselves later on in the learning process after they've already used other strategies. So again, this is consistent with the idea that learners are using testing as a monitoring tool. So they might use it just to double check that they know the material they're learning. And although a multitude of research has shown that repeated retrieval across time is the most beneficial for learning, students rarely engage in such a strategy, and instead they only test themselves once or twice in the process, and they may not be fully reaping the benefits of testing when they're using it on their own. And the final slide. Just to summarize, learners don't always appreciate the power of practice testing as a learning strategy. And this limits how much they can benefit from this strategy and use it effectively during their own learning. Now, the good news is that some interventions have shown to increase learners' effective use of this strategy, and they all involve some form of either correcting learners' beliefs, such as through direct instruction or actually giving students a demonstration, gaining experience with the strategy, promoting a supportive context, so instructors can make practice questions available for students to engage in practice testing, for example, and by increasing motivation to use the strategy, such as by making it more fun. For example, everybody likes trivia, but they don't necessarily like testing themselves in educational context. So some research has kind of combined that idea and made it more enjoyable. And that is the conclusion of my talk. And I'm happy to share more. I know this was kind of a quick overview, but thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Always great to have you at our conference. There's a question from Thomas Marlin. He comments that learners might not have access to questions with solutions. Could this limit the application of self-testing?
Yeah, absolutely. So learners also tend to test themselves when they know they're going to receive feedback. So testing plus restudying seems to be a more utilized strategy than just testing alone. And it also is more powerful that way. So providing solutions, providing feedback is also very important for getting learners to appreciate the strategy.
Thanks. And it's interesting you mentioned about people liking trivia, but not necessarily in an educational context. One idea that we've been playing around with based on the pub quiz idea that we did last night was imagine setting up a pub quiz for introductory psychology where teams enter and there's standings and there's cheering. Could be interesting. We might experiment.
Absolutely. That sounds really great.
Active things to do. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.
And as our next speaker comes online, it's Skylar Laursen, who works with Chris Fiacconi. The title of their presentation is Contextual Influences on the Reciprocal Relationship Between Monitoring and Control Strategies in Self-Regulated Learning. Welcome, Skylar.
Sorry, it's just not letting me start my video for some reason, but that is all right. Okay, so today I'll be talking about the link between monitoring and control in meta-memory. Next slide. All right, so monitoring and control are often considered in educational settings. While the former refers to one's ability to evaluate and assess learning, the latter refers to one's ability to implement and appropriately adjust learning activities. So one common way to study the link between monitoring and control is to investigate the correspondence between individuals' judgments of learning, or JOLs, which are prospective metacognitive predictions of future memory performance, and study time allocation. Now, the link between monitoring and control and their relationship is often considered cyclical in nature, such that one's monitoring may dictate the implementation of subsequent control strategies, while feedback from these control strategies may also impact ongoing monitoring processes. Now, based on this cyclical nature, you may expect that a given cue that impacts one of these processes may also impact the other. One cue that has been shown to impact JOLs is context. So what do I mean by context? Next slide. So previous literature has demonstrated that JOLs are comparative in nature. Therefore, it's not an item's absolute magnitude that guides JOLs, but rather the contrast between different items. So like the Ebbinghaus solution on the left, although the two orange circles are the exact same size, the one on the left appears smaller because of the context it is presented in. So imagine if these two orange circles were items that you had to remember for an upcoming test of memory. You may expect that you would give the one on the left a lower JOL rating, meaning that you would predict you'd be less likely to remember it later on because the context makes it appear more difficult. Therefore, we wanted to investigate whether the relative differences between items or the context in which stimuli are presented, which have been shown to impact individuals' monitoring, also regulate adjustments in control strategies. Next slide. So to investigate this research question, we manipulated the context that stimuli were presented. So our stimulus pool included easy or highly related word pairs, such as brother-sister, medium word pairs, which are word pairs that could be related using some sort of connecting variable, such as lemon-sun, for which the connector would be that they are both yellow, and difficult or entirely unrelated word pairs, such as emperor-heavy. Now, to manipulate context, we presented the medium word pairs together in a list with either the easy or the difficult word pairs. Participants had an unlimited amount of time to study each word pair and were then required to make a JLL rating. Now, when presented alongside the easy word pairs, the medium word pairs should appear more difficult in comparison when presented alongside the difficult word pairs, where they should appear easier. Therefore, we hypothesize that JLL ratings given for medium word pairs will be greater when presented in a difficult as compared to an easy context. And we also hypothesize that if context exerts parallel effects on study time, that the amount of study time allocated to medium word pairs will be greater when presented in an easy as compared to a difficult context. Next slide. So in the first panel, we see that JLL ratings for medium word pairs were in fact greater when presented in a difficult as compared to an easy context. However, in the second panel, we see that there was no difference in study time for medium word pairs in a difficult and easy context. Now, based on this result, it appears that context does not impact how individuals control their learning. However, we decided to further investigate whether context affects how control impacts monitoring. So to do this, we separated study time into two distinct bins, one with the smallest study times and one with the largest. And critically, what we see in the third panel is a significant interaction between medium items in an easy and difficult context. So specifically, we see that when presented in a difficult context, study times for medium word pairs follow the same pattern of results as the easy word pairs, such that longer study times correspond to lower JLL ratings. In contrast, when presented in an easy context, we see that study times follow the same pattern of results for the difficult word pairs, such that longer study times correspond to higher JLL ratings. So this result suggests that context impacts how individuals interpret study time. Next slide. All right, so just an overview. Here we've presented evidence that context can impact how individuals monitor their learning. And although we did not provide evidence that it affects how individuals control their learning directly, we did show that it can affect how control impacts subsequent monitoring. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Skylar. Based on your work so far, is there a preliminary prescription or recommendation that you could make for teachers?
I don't know if there's anything that I would recommend specifically for teachers, but I would say like it's definitely good for students to think about the order of things that they're studying. Because for example, let's say that you were really struggling with one subject, but you're really good at another, the way that you interpret your learning or the amount of time that you've invested may differ depending on sort of what subjects, in what order, how you're studying them.
Okay, so we were talking earlier a bit in Ji and Sun's talk about getting research from the lab to, the prescription to the classroom. So can you give us a sense of like, what's next? Like how much more research has to be done to turn this into some sort of prescription, just so people kind of get a sense of the work that's involved?
Yeah, so I think you would definitely need to sort of bring this into maybe a real world setting. So I think we've talked about like possibly if you have two different concepts in one course, maybe one's easy, one's different, you definitely have to bring the research into a classroom, maybe ask students to judge how well they think they're going to perform on concept A on a test compared to concept B. Maybe one's a little bit harder than the other. Currently right now, obviously we're just using word pairs, but we would obviously, if you wanted to make it more real world applicable, you would want to bring that research into the classroom to sort of get an idea of maybe multiple choice questions, things like that.
Okay. Thanks so much, Skylar, for a great talk. Okay, our next speaker will be Lydia Hicks. who works with Emily Caron and Dan Smilek. The title of her presentation is COVID-19 in the Classroom, the Impact of the Global Pandemic on Undergraduate Learning Experiences. Go ahead, Lydia.
Great. Thanks, Joe, and thanks to everyone for tuning in today. I'm Lydia, and today I'll be telling you a little bit about the data that my lab and I collected on how COVID-19 has impacted the undergraduate learning experience. Next slide. There we go. Okay, my internet's a little bit laggy, so apologies about that. With the announcement of the pandemic, several Canadian universities shifted all face-to-face learning to online learning. This was unexpected, and it left students with little timing to adjust to new work routines and new work environments. We were interested in examining how this shift impacted students' affective moods, their attentional behavior, and their time perception, as each of these are important in student learning. To examine this, we had students in a second-year course at the University of Waterloo complete our brief class questionnaire, which you can see in the middle of the screen. And that was done 3 weeks after the announcement of the shift to online learning. Using the STEM, relative to your experience before COVID-19 prevention measures were implemented and classes were suspended, we were able to gauge changes in students' motivation and school anxiety, which you can see in blue, focus, flow, mind wandering, external distractions, and mindless tech use, which you can see in green, and abilities to track time and day, which you can see in purple. In addition, we also had access to responses from the University of Waterloo's mass testing survey, which some students in the course had also completed prior to the announcement of the pandemic, giving us access to a pre-measure of students' attention failures, self-control, and affective states. Next slide. In the brief class questionnaire responses, we saw several trends. So looking at the green graphs of attentional behaviors, we can see that students perceived their abilities to focus and tendencies for flow to have drastically decreased, while reports of mind wandering, external distractions, and mindless tech use drastically increased. For affective moods in blue, we see motivation decreased while school anxiety increased, and for time perception in purple, we see abilities to track both time and day were perceived to decrease as well. Next slide. We were also interested in how these questionnaire responses correlated with one another. So again, our attention variables are in green, our affect variables are in blue, and our time perception variables are in purple. We also wanted to see how these post-pandemic questionnaire variables were correlated with our pre-pandemic trait measures, which you can see in gray. So the general trends for the brief class questionnaire, which is in the left side of the table, were that measures of worsening attention, such as reduced focus and increased mind wandering, were correlated with measures of decreased motivation and increased school anxiety. Measures of worsening attention, specifically mindless tech use, were correlated with reduced abilities to keep track of time. Looking at the right side, we see for the mass testing scales that pre-pandemic reports of poor attentional control were correlated with poorer abilities to focus and track time, as well as increased mindless tech use. Next slide. Thus, this study demonstrates how post-pandemic attentional behaviors relate to affective moods and time perception, as well as pre-pandemic measures of attentional control. So next, we plan to replicate these results with a second sample of undergraduate students who are going to be collected next week, and we plan to extend this examination to a more diverse sample collected online. In the meantime, we hope to demonstrate to current education providers how working to improve attention-related behaviors and outcomes can impact motivation and school-related anxiety, and vice versa. So, for example, including course components that are in line with students' intrinsically motivated goals may aid in improving their attention-related behaviors in online classrooms as the pandemic continues. We also hope this work can be considered beyond the pandemic as the move towards online learning continues to grow at various different levels of education. Next slide. So with that, I'd like to thank each of you for listening, and I'd also like to thank my collaborators and supervisor, Dan Smilek, as well as my lab mate, Emily Caron, the project funders, and the rest of my lab mates. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lydia. So as we go into this fall term, I guess two questions. So if there was someone, a friend of yours, who was thinking about going to university, would you tell them to go ahead and enter this fall, or should they take a year off and maybe reconsider? And what things should they keep in mind?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that probably depends a lot on individual differences and personal preferences. I think for myself, I have a hard time paying attention for like 3 hours worth of a Zoom call or a video lecture. And so I think maybe if it were me, I would also maybe wait a year as well. But obviously you can't do that for everyone either. You can't put everyone's education on pause. So probably attack it from an individual differences standpoint though.
Very good. Thanks so much, Lydia.
Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is going to be Bill Ju, who has worked on this project with Amanda Saniti, Azin Amini. The title of the talk is Metacognitive Multiple Choice, better for everyone and not as complicated as it might sound. I'm very anxious to hear about this.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Actually, I had a few other people who helped out as well. We try to run a course where we have like students participating in a community engaged learning type of project that's going on in the background of the course as it's running. And so this project kind of came about as a result of the discussions that students were generating before the course started. And one of the things that we realized is that when students are writing their multiple choice test questions, they're often marking them up, and they're often writing down different things, and sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's not. And so we decided to try to investigate that in this course, and we decided to change up how we did the assessments in our course related to multiple choice. If I could get the next slide, please. So again, going through some of the rationale, a lot of times we're still using multiple choice test questions for a variety of reasons, and there are all sorts of debates as to whether or not this is pedagogically sound, if it's really a formative or a summative form of assessment, how fair that is to students, and whether or not it's a real-world authentic application. Nevertheless, I think we're all still using multiple choice test questions, and as a result of that, we wanted to actually go in as a class with those undergrads who unfortunately couldn't be here to present some of their ideas and examine whether or not we could tease out some of the metacognitive processes. Could they actually learn something during the course of writing a multiple choice test question about themselves, about the learning process, what sorts of things they need to go back to. And in many ways, it kind of fits in with what both Michelle as well as Skylar had introduced a little bit earlier on. So these metacognitive processes are ones that we want students to be able to demonstrate in these multiple choice test questions. And so this is what we were trying to do in this particular course. So if I could get the next slide, please. So our third year course, we have about 300 plus students registered in our neuroscience class. We had about 285, 286 students actually writing the term test. Again, they were told at the beginning of the year that the term test and the final exam would follow the same types of formats. And we did that even before we knew that we were going to do this community engaged learning project where our community was this particular class, and to see if there was any benefit in doing these types of tests. So we normally do a two-stage test. So students write the test individually, then they get into groups and discuss the answers and resubmit the test again. But in this particular year, in this particular cohort, and this was all pre-pivot, by the way, so this was in the fall of 2019, we had students writing the multiple choice test questions, but in addition to that, we also added sort of what we call the tail at the end of these multiple choice, which was standard for students in terms of multiple choice, but they now also had to indicate some of the metacognitive processes in the questions that they were able to answer. And if I can get the next slide, please. And here's an example of what those tails would look like. And this is what students had done in the fall as part of their original term test. So at the very top, you'll see a standard multiple choice test, and it's more application-based than just rote memorization. And then based on that test, after reading it, the students will have to go through and indicate what distractors they were able to identify, and that's at the very top from A through D. They're able to show their thinking processes in terms of what they identify as a distractor, as well as the correct answer. So they still have to identify the correct answer. And then they have questions at the bottom, which I hope shows up on your screens in terms of how they prepared or how they thought they prepared. Did they actually study for this material? Again, going back to a lot of things that both Michelle and Skylar had talked about, contextualizing like their response in terms of what they were thinking of at that moment. Additionally, we wanted students to be thinking more along the lines of the theory of mind. How did they think the rest of the class was going to do? Did they feel like this was going to be an easy question for them or a more challenging question for the rest of the class? And so in that second stage, they were able to actually see a lot of these processes directly in talking to their classmates. So it wasn't just about taking up the answers, but also like going over what everyone else was thinking as well. And if I could get the next slide, please. And so one of the more surprising things, even though the students came up with this project, not everyone really thought that this was beneficial, and not everyone thought that this was something that would help them in other courses. About 78% of them did feel like it was helpful, it was useful for when they actually came in and viewed their tests again. It helped them to reframe and refocus and also have a better sense as to where they went wrong. They were allowed to come in 3 days after writing the term test and doing that second stage, and they were allowed to go through their answers and get back that sort of reflective, metacognitive multiple choice test question. And again, about 78% of students who went through and did this actually thought it was useful, and they thought that they would apply it in other classes, but it wasn't universal, and it wasn't something that was a panacea for like everyone studying for these different multiple choice test questions. Did they do better, which is on the next slide? On that final exam, they did a little bit better, but not statistically significantly so. I hope that sounded right. So it wasn't statistically significant, but overall there was a trend for students to have done a little bit better on the multiple choice, on the final exam. And overall, it did help students to understand a lot of where they stood within their own classes and how they were able to go back and re-examine their own time management, their own study habits, and whether or not interventions were going to be needed for their courses. So generally, we thought that this was an interesting sort of result. And then, of course, the whole pandemic pivot came along. Everyone's changing up how they do their online testing. We are going to open book, and so we're kind of re-examining how we're going to incorporate this sort of in the online environment as well. And just before I wrap up, I just wanted to thank all my colleagues, the organizers for EdCog2020, and all of my students, as well as my fellow panelists. And that's about it.
Thanks so much, Bill. This is really interesting, really innovative way of doing a multiple choice question test. I'd love to actually chat more with you after the fact. But one question I had was these metacognitive tales, how much time does it add to answering a question for a student perspective?
Right, so we typically tell students in advance that it's going to take about, they have 20 multiple choice test questions. We typically give them a full 45 minutes to go through the multiple choice. We decided to add on extra time in terms of about an extra half hour. We didn't find that students actually had to write very much for many of these different things. And so just adding on an extra half hour, we don't do it for every single question, Joe, so that might be something that you take into account as well. We did it for ones where we found that the students were generally having to apply their knowledge. We do stick in a few questions that are just purely like rote memorization to kind of get students through the test. So this kind of goes back to what Skylar was talking about earlier, just so they feel a little bit more comfortable and confident about what they're answering. So we don't do it for like every single question, but about maybe 15 out of the 20 questions.
So there's one concept that students learning about in problem solving in my introductory psychology course. It's the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning. And I found that students were just answering this question at chance level. They just really didn't understand it. So I could see how putting in this metacognitive tail where they have to identify the distractors, explain why something is not inductive or deductive reasoning could be an interesting benefit. So yeah, I'd love to chat with you more later on. We're gonna move on to our next presentation. Presented by Alyssa Smith. The title of her talk is Deep Effortless Learning, Flow Predicts Engagement, Understanding, and Grades in Undergraduate Lectures. Welcome, Alyssa.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, so you may have heard athletes and artists refer to the experience of being in the zone. This experience is also known as flow, which is characterized as a deep, effortless concentration. And given the importance of concentration in learning, our goal was to better understand the relations between flow, attention, and learning in undergraduate lectures. Next slide. So to investigate this, we assessed trait flow at the beginning of the term and then probed engagement and understanding during live lectures. Here's a timeline of our study. So at the beginning of term, all students in our study completed a battery of psychological questionnaires. One of these questionnaires assessed trait flow, deep, effortless concentration. And as you can see below the orange box, it asked about students' tendency to experience flow in everyday life. It included items such as, I get in the zone and don't have to force myself to concentrate on the task I am doing. Students then signed up for the study and were recruited from 7 undergraduate psychology courses in either fall or winter. To probe engagement and understanding during lecture, as Jeff talked about earlier, students downloaded a laptop application that presented them with probes in the corner of their laptop screen during class. And as you can see above the green box, engagement and understanding were rated on a slider 3 to 5 times during each lecture for about 3 months. And then at the end of term, instructors provided us with students' final grades in the course. So let's look at our findings. Next slide, please. So when looking at the association between trait, deep, effortless concentration on the x-axis and state engagement during lectures, we found a positive relation between deep, effortless concentration and engagement, such that students who reported experiencing more deep, effortless concentration also reported being more engaged during lecture. Next slide, please. When looking at the relation between deep, effortless concentration and understanding, we also find a positive relation between deep, effortless concentration and understanding, such that students who reported experiencing more deep, effortless concentration also reported understanding more material during lecture. Next slide. And finally, when examining the link between deep, effortless concentration and grades, we again found a positive relation between deep, effortless concentration and grades, such that students who reported experiencing more deep, effortless concentration also received higher grades in the course. Now, again, as Jeff talked about earlier, a lot of research has examined inattention in lecture and how inattention can be detrimental to learning. And because of this, we controlled for a frequently studied form of inattention in the classroom, mind wandering. And when we controlled for this, we found that the relations between engagement, understanding, and grades all still remain significant. And this suggested to us that flow may therefore be a more fruitful topic of interest for future research in the classroom. So now that I've told you that experiencing more deep, effortless concentration or flow is quite beneficial to students in the classroom, as a result, many of you may be thinking, is there anything I can do that may help facilitate flow for students during class? And there's some work demonstrating that mindfulness meditation can briefly help facilitate flow during an attention task in the lab. And researchers hypothesize that practicing mindfulness may help students prevent distracting thoughts when they're focusing on a task. So future research could examine if a mindfulness practice prior to beginning a lecture or prior to beginning class may help facilitate flow in students. And that's the end of my talk. I'd just like to thank all my collaborators for their support and their hard work on this project.
Thanks so much, Alyssa. I felt like we were in flow with the slide there. Can you tell me about the connection between mind wandering, mindfulness, and flow? Are these all different concepts, or are they related somehow?
So usually we do find that like mindfulness like a mindfulness practice has been found in the literature to like decrease mind wandering in the lab. And we typically find kind of like a negative relation between like trait level mind wandering and trait level flow, such that people who report experiencing more flow in everyday life typically also experience less mind wandering. And there's some correlations also that show that trait mindfulness is also positively related to trait flow as well.
Okay.
But those are all kind of individual differences, personality type level stuff.
Okay. I've got one more question from my arch nemesis, Chris Biacconi, who asks, is DEC confounded with attentional control? And are those who have high DEC better at attentional control, which affects grades?
We did some work looking at the relation between flow and attentional control. Unfortunately, like the reliability of the attentional control scale was kind of poor, but I do believe that they were negatively related. So I think that they would be distinct constructs there. Okay,
thanks so much. So our next speaker is Jessica Saini. The title of her presentation is examining how novices learn neuroanatomy through eye tracking technology.
Thank you. All right, so hi everyone. My name is Jessica Saini.
I'm Angela.
And I'm Beata.
And what we'll be presenting today is a study on neuroanatomical education, examined with the use of eye tracking technology. So it's a follow-up to a prior study that looked at the impact of high and low contrast materials on neuroanatomical learning. Next slide, please.
So first of all, why neuroanatomy as a context? In the field of anatomical education, there exists the phenomenon of neurophobia, where students are fearing the study of neuroscience. Is it because of high levels of difficulty? Is it being caused by inefficient learning or teaching methods? No one really knows, which makes it difficult for educators to know how to help their students overcome the barrier. The study that we've conducted uses eye tracking technology to examine how novices, meaning those with zero prior anatomical education, learn neuroanatomy, so that we could gain a better understanding of how students are approaching the material when they encounter it for the first time.
So let's talk a little bit about what we did. Oh, Joe, just back to the previous slide, if you don't mind. Yeah, so we collected data from 118 participants who were undergraduate students with no formal anatomy education at McMaster University. Each participant then underwent a 1-hour eye tracking session where they wore an eye tracking headset and were tested on digital human brain slices as seen on the bottom left. If we follow the flowchart on the right, we can see that each eye tracking session had 2 trial periods. So each trial period had 1 acquisition period and then 1 testing period. And then in the acquisition period, students learned neuroanatomical structures from a set of labeled stained or unstained brain slices that were cut on the same plane. Participants were then tested on similar low contrast images. And to counterbalance their data, each participant was randomly assigned to one of 4 groups, A, B, C, or D. Each group differed in contrast or in orientation conditions during the acquisition period. So for example, if we look at group A on the chart, we can see that those participants learned the stained transfer slices first in their first trial, and then learned the unstained coronal slices in their second trial period. And so group A and B's conditions counterbalance with that of group D and C's respectively. After the eye tracking session, all participants completed the automated operation span test, also known as OSPAN, to quantify working memory capacity. So if we go on to the next slide. If we go on to the next slide, let's talk about assessing the gaze patterns. So to assess the student viewing patterns, we use the iLink2 system from SR Research, and this technology essentially uses cameras to track the pupil and corneal reflections to establish a visual representation of a participant's gaze on display screen images. So unfortunately, the video does not work here, but the video essentially will show, if we were able to play it, it would have shown how the camera tracks an individual's eye movements. So the pink dot would track the pupil, and while the green dot would track the corneal reflection. On the left is the corresponding eye tracking data that actually can be collected from the system. And it's of the same participant in the video, which unfortunately you can't see. So the blue circles here are the static fixation points, and the size of the circle is proportional to the time participants spent or dwelled on that specific area. This also shows us where the persons looked at during the acquisition and testing periods. So if we move on to the next slide, we can look at how we assess this data.
So first we identified eye tracking metrics from the literature. Eye tracking metrics are different ways for us to measure how people look at a given image. So for example, one metric that we looked at is interest area fixation count, which is essentially the number of times someone fixates on the correct answer. And so we also performed two important steps. The first was combining data across slice orientation. We did this because there was no difference in accuracy for coronal and transverse conditions. The orientation didn't affect student performance. In the top right, you can see that we combined the groups that only differed in terms of the orientation for the two testing periods. So the second step we looked at working memory capacity in relation to accuracy, and we found that there was no correlation, meaning short-term memory didn't influence how well students scored, as seen in the graph on the right side. And so overall, we knew that orientation and memory didn't affect student accuracy, but we didn't know the answer to the big question yet. Could accuracy or staining influence the results of eye tracking metrics? In other words, could we find any gaze patterns if we divided groups based on how well they performed, their accuracy, or if they were looking at low or high contrast images, the staining? Next slide, please. And so what did we find? To answer this question, we split our participants into three groups: low, medium, and high accuracy, as you can see on the x-axis. We also looked at low contrast unstained and high contrast stained conditions, as seen in the yellow and blue box and whisker plots respectively. So we want to figure out whether dividing the groups would reveal any differences in gaze patterns as measured by the 5 eye tracking metrics. And overall, we found no effective accuracy or staining on any of the metrics, meaning we couldn't find gaze patterns based on how well students performed or if they were looking at low or high contrast images. Next slide, please. And so, though our analysis found no effect of either accuracy nor contrast on the gaze patterns of our novice participants, overall, we've gained quantitative insights into neuroanatomical learning. For example, knowing how long it's taking for students to fixate on the correct area before answering can potentially inform instructors if certain strategies and techniques need to be taught or refined. So in terms of future directions, we'll analyze additional metrics from our novice data pool and then look to gather expert data to, one, see if gaze patterns are viable as a physiological measure of expertise in this context, and two, explore the potential of feed-forward teaching and learning in the context of neuroanatomical education. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think I might ask you the same question that I asked of Skylar. What has to happen next before what emerges from this research line would be some sort of recommendation that you could give to instructors?
Well, next step that we're actually going to be taking is looking at experts and seeing whether or not we can identify gaze patterns. And if that is the case, then we're hoping to essentially create visual materials that can give pointers to students on where to look in order to actually learn different neuroanatomical structures. So pretty much, how do you look at an image the same way that an expert would, and would that improve learning for students, since neuroanatomy seems to be such a difficult topic for people to learn?
Yeah, there might be some interesting potential research lines of just looking at online learning and where people are looking at on the screen for neuroanatomy or other types of educational materials. Thank you so much. All right. We're going to move on to our final Data Blitz speaker, Stefan Mladjenovic.
Mladjenovic, yeah, thank you.
Exactly. The title of his talk is EdCog2020 to support learning in class and online.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Hello and welcome everyone to this presentation, Mapping Perceptions of EdCog2020 in the Life Sciences. As Joe mentioned, my name is Stefan Mladjenovic, and I'm very lucky to work with Dr. Katie Moyse in the School of Interdisciplinary Sciences at McMaster University. Next slide, please. So a little bit about what we did in this study, how and why we conducted this study, beginning with why. There is a need for virtual learning for both educators who will be teaching in an online virtual environment during fall 2020, as well as for students who have long been demanding accessible education, including virtual learning. We conducted this study by surveying students in the Life Sciences program in October of 2019 to understand their experiences with the lecture capture system called EdCog2020. But what is EdCog2020? EdCog2020 is a lecture capture system which records both audio and video. It has many educational features for students, including note-taking abilities, virtual discussion spaces, polling, activity slides, such as multiple choice and short answer questions, live streams, and the ability for students to simultaneously listen to lectures while viewing their lecturer's slides. EdCog2020 is very accessible. Not only is it IOTA compliant, but there is no additional cost for students to use this platform compared to, let's say, iClickers. Next slide, please. On the left, we began by looking at which flexible learning needs student identified. We see that commuting and learning best at different times of day are the most common needs of students. On the right figure here, we wanted to see how students feel about using EdCog2020 in their classes. What we see is that students using EdCog2020 find course content to be more engaging, have increased participation, improved performance, better understanding of course content, and especially relevant is that course content is more accessible. This is crucial to meet the diverse flexible learning needs of students outlined on the left. More than 50% of students agreed or strongly agreed that EdCog2020 was beneficial for each of these areas. Next slide, please. Now we wanted to understand which features allowed for EdCog2020 to be so beneficial for students. And what we see is that lecture replays, pre-recorded videos, and live streaming, as highlighted here, of lectures appear to be the three most important features to help with student learning. All of these 9 features had more than 60% of students responding that they either greatly helped or slightly helped with student learning. Next slide, please. On the left, we asked students, if given the choice to attend classes in person, online, or some combination of the two, which would you prefer? And we see that students enjoy the flexibility of a hybrid approach to attend classes both in person and online. However, now that we are forced into being online exclusively, on the right-hand side of this slide, we show that data from a separate study we conducted. Here, in a course using EdCog2020 with 150 students, students could either attend virtually or in person. And so we asked these students, how satisfied are you with your grade? And we saw that students were just as satisfied, if not more satisfied, if attending online. And this gives us some comfort that we can deliver a beneficial online experience now that we have to for fall 2020. However, we can't say this is exclusively because of EdCog2020, and our sample size for this study on the right was only 29. Next slide, please. In conclusion, we see that students have positive experiences with using EdCog2020, which also meets their flexible learning needs. Live streams, pre-recorded videos, and lecture replays appear to be the most useful features for enhancing student learning. And we see that students appreciate the flexibility of attending classes in person as well as virtually. Educators may find EdCog2020 to be a useful tool, not only during fall 2020, but also beyond, especially if you build the infrastructure, when it is safe for in-person classes to resume. Some limitations of this study is that only life sciences students were surveyed, and this study was conducted before classes were only virtual as in fall 2020. In the future, we hope to expand this survey to other programs and faculties and to better understand experiences in this virtual-only learning environment of fall 2020. Thank you for the organizers, the panelists, and everyone listening, and to Dr. Katie Moyse, my research supervisor.
Thanks so much, Stefan. So I know that Katie Moyse is one of the leaders in using EdCog2020. And there's a question from Sarah. Are other professors actually taking advantage of these features of EdCog2020? And do you think that affects which features students think are most helpful?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So I don't have data on which features educators use, but I do know from conversations with educators as well as on their students who are the ultimate end user, that a lot of features which are commonly used and appreciated are the live streaming, as well as the ability to re-watch lectures. So one of the challenges of students is that you're so hung up on writing everything the lecturer is writing or presenting. So you're writing that down. So you're not actively critically thinking about what is being said in the lecture. You're preoccupied with writing. So I think there is diversity in the features which educators use. And I definitely believe that many educators perhaps are not aware of these features, as well as students, which is another great opportunity for building upon in the future, especially in this 2020 fall environment online.
Okay. There's one technical question from Amanda Blay. Does EdCog2020 allow for timestamp recording of internal computer sound?
So when you record so there are like transcripts. So as you speak, it's automatically transcribed, and that is timestamped. Sometimes like the words which are automatically transcribed from speech into text aren't perfect. So if you say the word like, I don't know, bottle, it might think you said wobble or something like that, but it is timestamped to answer that question.
Okay. Thanks so much, Stefan.
Thank
All right.
you.
That brings us to the conclusion of our Data Blitz presentations.